Hello, this is Tony Hiller from RealClimateScience.com, the climate guy setting the record straight about climate. This video is titled, Ice Doesn't Lie, but NASA and NOAA climate scientists do. I'm going to compare NASA and NOAA claims about global temperature versus Arctic ice records from the 1930s and 1940s. According to NASA and NOAA, the last 10 years have been the hottest on record on Earth, and the Arctic is the place that's warming the fastest. If the last 10 years have been the hottest on record and the Arctic is the fastest warming place on Earth, then Arctic ice must be disappearing. Now let's look at what Arctic ice has done over the last decade. This map is from the Danish Meteorological Institute and it shows the thickness of Arctic ice. The green, yellow, and red areas represent ice which is more than 5 feet thick. The date of this map is from 10 years ago, and as you can see, 10 years ago you had to go almost all the way to the North Pole to see ice that was 5 feet thick. Now let's compare with present Arctic ice. As you can see, there's been a huge expansion of ice since 2007 out into the East Siberian Sea. It now extends about 700 miles further than it did 10 years ago. This is the thick ice edge now, and this is where it was 10 years ago. So we've seen a huge expansion in the area of thick ice over the last decade, which of course hasn't been reported by the press. But the ice hasn't always been expanding. Between 1890 and 1940, there was a huge reduction in the amount of Arctic sea ice, particularly the amount of thick Arctic sea ice. This article is dated October 13th, 1940. Ice in Arctic melting rapidly. Washington, the ice of the Arctic Ocean is melting so rapidly that more than 1/3 of it has disappeared in the last 50 years. In 1893, the peak ice thickness was about 365 centimeters, but in 1940 it declined to only 218 centimeters. Now let's compare the 218 centimeters in 1940 with current sea ice thickness. As you can see, it's about the same. The ice is about the same thickness now as it was in 1940. So now let's put this in the context of NASA's global temperature graph. The ice was melting very rapidly back here in 1940, and now the ice is expanding when temperatures are much warmer. This graph doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. There are two different types of ice in the Arctic. One is Arctic sea ice, which we've already looked at, and we've shown that it's expanded over the last decade, and the other is glacial ice, most of which is located in Greenland. According to the Danish Meteorological Institute, Greenland's surface has gained huge amounts of ice over the last 2 years, near record levels of ice gain, in fact. Once again, the gain in ice on Greenland's surface has not been reported by the press. No surprise there. But Greenland hasn't always been gaining ice. In fact, back in 1939, the glaciers of Greenland and Norway were facing catastrophic collapse. December 17th, 1939. Greenland's glaciers melting, says scientists. Stockholm, Sweden, December 16th. All the glaciers in eastern Greenland are rapidly melting, declared Professor Hans Alman, Swedish geologist. He was the leading authority of his age. It may without exaggeration be said that the glaciers, like those in Norway, face the possibility of a catastrophic collapse. So let's put this in the context of NASA's temperature graph once again. They show 1939 as a very cold year, and they show the present as being very hot. Yet in 1939, the glaciers of Greenland and Norway were rapidly disappearing, and now the glaciers are gaining ice. This doesn't make a lot of sense. Given that the freezing point of water hasn't changed, and that Arctic ice was rapidly melting in 1940, it would make sense to believe that 1940 was warmer than now because now the Arctic ice is expanding. The current NASA graph simply is incredible. Back in 1940, Arctic sea ice was rapidly disappearing and the glaciers of Greenland and Norway were facing catastrophic collapse. Whereas now we've seen that there's been a large increase over the last decade in the area of thick Arctic ice. We've also seen that Greenland's surface has gained near record amounts of ice over the last 2 years. Now let's compare NASA's non-credible temperature graph with a graph produced by the National Center for Atmospheric Research in 1974. The 1974 NCAR graph showed a lot of warming before 1940 and a lot of cooling after that. Well, that has disappeared from the NASA current graph. This graph overlays NASA's current graph in red with the NCAR 1974 graph in black. You can see very clearly what NASA's done. They've removed the 1940s spike in temperature and sharp cooling after that into the 1970s. NASA didn't do this all at once, though. This project of removing the 1940s temperature spike began decades ago. In 1981, the black line here, NASA showed a big temperature spike around 1940. By 2001, which is the red line, they had removed a lot of the 1940 spike, and now they've made it completely disappear. This data tampering did not occur accidentally. One of the ClimateGate emails shows what the climate scientists were up to. This ClimateGate email is from Tom Wigley at NCAR to Phil Jones at the University of East Anglia in England, two of the big names in global warming. If we could reduce the ocean blip by, say, 0.15 degrees centigrade, this would be significant for the global mean, but we'd still have to explain the land blip. It would be good to remove at least part of the 1940s blip, but we're still left with why the blip. So they wanted to get rid of this spike in temperature in 1940, but they didn't have any explanation for why they were going to do it. And yet we can see that's exactly what they did. They removed the 1940 spike in temperature. So according to the current fake NASA temperature graph, we have Arctic ice melting in 1940 when it was cold, and we have Arctic ice growing at the present when it's very hot. This graph makes no sense. The current NASA temperature graph is a byproduct of decades of data tampering designed to prove global warming theory. The tens of billions of dollars which the government has poured into global warming research has completely corrupted the field. All that's important is that funding keeps coming in, and scientists will cheat, lie, and tamper with data in order to make sure their next grant comes in. The freezing point of water hasn't changed, but government temperature graphs have. Science doesn't get any worse than this. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science for a long time.